Zuchenko, I hope we hear and see each other well. And thank you for participating in our TV program.
Thank you very much, sir. It's my pleasure.
So, what were your first impressions when you arrived in Sarajevo in summer 1992? And in what rank and position were you at UNPROFOR at that time?
I arrived in Sarajevo on 15 July 1992 as a United Nations staff officer. And after an introductory meeting with the then UNPROFOR Sector Commander General Louis Mackenzie, I was appointed to the position of the Senior Operations Officer. Essentially, my job was to monitor the situation on the ground, keep record of the incoming humanitarian aid, arrange missions and convoys, and also write reports for the United Nations headquarters in Zagreb. General Mackenzie was a professional military officer with a lot of UN experience, but on 1st August 1992 he left. The problem was that RBH government demanded that the general should remove interpreters who were Serbs from the UN headquarters. The explanation was that there were too many of them. Of course, the general could not do that. He ran into much trouble with the then government of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and essentially he was accused of a crime. Despite the fact that the UN Commission, which was specially convened to investigate this matter, exonerated him of all allegations, he left and was replaced by an Egyptian General Abdul Razak. And he brought with him a chief of staff, an Egyptian colonel. If I recall, his name was Ahmed. And this colonel was, in a few days after his arrival, badly wounded in a shelling. So General Abdul Razak appointed me as the chief of staff of Sector Sarajevo, and I was performing this duty until mid-1993. My first impressions of Sarajevo in summer 1992 were extremely dramatic, if not to say shocking. I had previous war experience, but this was something special. The first few days were quiet, but on 31st July, the Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina launched an offensive operation which was called Polinia. We didn't know that about this operation at that time. I had no idea what was going on. But suddenly the artillery shelling rate increased dramatically. Our observers reported that there was a lot of outgoing fire from Igman and from the city proper into the Serb positions, and the Serbs also returned artillery fire on the city. Many civilians were killed and wounded, and many buildings were damaged. The headquarters of UNPROFOR was monitoring the situation, and we had two special counter-battery radars, which were brought from the Ukraine on the special request of General Mackenzie. We deployed these radars a few days before this offensive operation started, and we managed to pinpoint and locate the exact locations of the artillery which was firing. But in a few days, these radars, at least one of them, was destroyed by Muslim soldiers. When we made the investigation, we found that it was destroyed by a handheld grenade. In fact, by a rifle-launched grenade, whose tail fin we found in the trench. So it was fired from a very short range. I had an impression that, in fact, somebody didn't really want us to know what was really going on in and around Sarajevo, and they just blinded us. We could not understand which artillery was firing from which location. And of course, the reports of our military observers were not entirely complete and not entirely reliable. The situation was indeed dramatic and very bad. This population was suffering a lot. There was no electricity, no water, and there was a lot of pressure on us to arrange evacuation of civilians from Sarajevo, which we did. At least 2 or 3 convoys, as far as I can remember, were organized by UNPROFOR, and they left the city, but not without difficulties, of course. Well, these are my impressions in brief, but from the point of view of the United Nations, this situation in summer '92 is best described in the book by General Mackenzie, The Peacekeeper, The Road to Sarajevo, which was published in Canada in 1993. So you can actually refer yourself to this book if you want more details.
Did you have meetings with representatives of the both sides involved in the conflict?
Yes, this was a part of my regular duties. I was chairing the meetings between the warring parties within the framework of the so-called Mixed Military Working Group, which was established by UNPROFOR as a forum for discussions of the issues related to Sarajevo, and in fact the entire Bosnia and Herzegovina. In this way, UNPROFOR was trying to maintain communication with the both parties and make arrangements for delivery of humanitarian aid, freedom of movement, and utility missions, as well as opening of the so-called blue routes. As far as I remember, the Serb side demonstrated a lot of interest in opening blue routes out of the city for the Serbs to leave Sarajevo. They were really adamant about that. The Serb side also wanted to open a blue route between Lukavica and Kasendo Hospital, because the RBIH snipers were firing at the Serb ambulances which were moving between these 2 locations. This was rejected by the Muslim side. On the other hand, the government insisted on opening blue routes to Tuzla and Visoko. They also wanted us to make a reconnaissance in the direction of Mostar to find out what was going on there, because there was already a Croat-Muslim conflict incipient in this area. Essentially, they wanted to do the reconnaissance by our hands. And several meetings of this kind were held, but not really with any results. Basically, these were futile discussions. The parties could not agree about anything. On the RBH side, I had meetings with Colonel Shiber, and I had several meetings with General Talian. And on the Serb side, I had most often meetings with Colonel Žarković and General Galić, who was the Sarajevo Romania Corps commander. Colonel Žarković was the chief liaison officer for the BRS. Meetings with Shiber, as far as I remember, were particularly difficult. He always wanted to set us up and was haranguing us on how we should implement our mandate. At one point, I told him that we had our own staff to advise us on how we should implement our mandate.
And did you learn from conversation with representatives of authorities in Sarajevo about the terror of the regime Alija Izetbegović against the Serbs?
Well, we were picking up bits and pieces of information from everywhere, of course. But you should understand also that we were in a way isolated. I had a distinct impression that the BiH government did not really want us to talk to the Serbs. And some information was nevertheless coming anyway. And as far as I remember, Colonel Žarković was the first who told me about the Dobrovoljačka street massacre. In fact, he was the survivor of this massacre. He told me that on 3rd of May 1992, a convoy of GNA military vehicles on the previous agreement with the government was trying to leave Sarajevo. And this agreement was made between General Mackenzie and, if I recall correctly, Mr. Ganic of the Bosnian government. But despite this agreement, Green Berets attacked the convoy and killed, according to Serb sources, 23 officers, soldiers, and civilians who did not really resist. They were disarmed before they were killed. I also remember one particular incident in September 92, when 3 or 4 Serb families, about 20 men, women, and children all together, came to the PTT building and entered the building past the sentries. They just stormed their way in. And they were hysterical, and they refused to leave the building because they said that they would be killed. They told us the story of the Ristovich family, of 5 persons who was killed, as I later learned, during lunch. They were killed by Bosnian police. And we really had a big problem on our hands because we didn't know what to do with these people. The Bosnian police surrounded the building and demanded that they should be kicked out. But we could not do that. And as far as I remember, the sector commander ordered that they should be fed, taken care of, and provided with blankets, and they spent the night at the basement of the building. And our people interviewed them. I don't remember the names because I didn't interview them myself, but the people who did told me later on about the situation which they described, and they were telling, terrible things. And essentially, this was indeed a very big problem for us because, and for me personally, because Colonel Shiber wanted me to remove from the headquarters because he told to Colonel Davud Dauerstadt, who was the sector commander at the time, that I should be removed because he believed that I led them into the building. In fact, this incident is described in Shiber's book, which he published after the war. The book is entitled something like Istina. But the book is really full of incorrect information, to say it mildly. Well, when I read the book after the war, in fact, I was still in Sarajevo, I called Shiber and asked him if he doesn't mind meeting and we could discuss, this kind of situation and sort out this misunderstanding if there was any. But he refused to meet me. Well, because he obviously had nothing to say. Well, anyway, we were getting information about crimes being committed against the Serbs. The situation was very chaotic. The RBH was not very organized, and we had an impression that, in fact, it was made up of various paramilitary units, and they still had their paramilitary habits and no real discipline. So there was no surprise that they were venting out their outrage because of their military failures at the civilian Serb population of Sarajevo.
How long you were engaged in Sarajevo, and what was your mandate, and how long were you engaged in the United Nations?
I was working within Sarajevo area for 1 year in the military capacity between 92 and 93. And after a short break, I returned to Sarajevo again in January 95 as United Nations Civil Affairs Officer, and was working there until the end of 2002. So in total, I spent in Sarajevo something like 7 to 8 years. I was running a small United Nations office, liaison office in eastern Sarajevo, and then District Sarajevo in the center of the city, and the region Sarajevo on the Federation side, which was covering Canton 9 and Canton 5, as well as a significant part of Republika Srpska from Sarajevo up to Drina. And all in all, my record of service with the United Nations is about 22 years. I spent this time in various countries of the world. It would take some time for me to enumerate all of them.
Mr. Bezruchenko, what do you consider as your achievement when it comes to your work?
When it comes to my work in Bosnia, I think the essence of our mandate there was to remove the underlying causes of the conflict. And one of those causes was the constitutional problem, constitutional inequality. As you recall, Article 1 of the Federation Constitution explicitly referred to Muslims and Croats as constitutive nations, but did not mention Serbs anywhere, but only mentioned others, which means that the Serbs living in the Federation territory, about 400,000 of them, according to some estimates, were basically not mentioned anywhere, which means that Serb people were not represented in the Federation Parliament and the Federation government proper. After the war, this problem became glaring because there are many misunderstandings and problems between the Republika Srpska and the Federation because of this particular issue. So the UN mission in Bosnia was trying to resolve this problem, and together with other international agencies and various NGOs, we managed to push through an arrangement of amendments for the three constitution of the country proper, the Constitution of Republika Srpska and the Constitution of the Federation, which equalized the rights of three people in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This happened in the year 2000, if I recall correctly. And I think this was an important achievement, which really contributed into peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But there were also other achievements. I was involved in the implementation of the International Arbitration Award for Brčko. And my biggest achievement at that moment was a creation of multi-ethnic and professional police in Brčko district, as well as creation of professional multi-ethnic police in Sarajevo and Gorazda, in accordance with the mandate of the UN mission at that time.
I forgot to tell you, I'm glad you mentioned the case of family Ristovic from Velešići. Okay, tell us now something about your work in the International Commission.
For me, this was extremely interesting and fascinating work because I have been taking keen interest in the history of the Balkans and read a lot, and I think by now I have accumulated quite a bit of knowledge about Bosnia and Herzegovina and its history, and particularly its military history. And in the Commission, we had a harmonious atmosphere, and we studied numerous documents, which, by courtesy of the Republika Srpska Center for Investigation of War Crimes and Search for Missing Persons, we got. And we also interviewed some witnesses. Unfortunately, we could not interview all of them, but at least we interviewed quite a big number. And I must say, I enjoyed working with my colleagues in a friendly and collaborative atmosphere.
As a military expert with a long experience in the United Nations, can you tell us what was the character of the war in BiH according to international standards and practices? Civil war, is it civil war, international war, religion war?
Well, you know, to this date, there is no single opinion in the international academic community on this issue. Some historians believe that the war in Bosnia was a war of aggression, which was waged by Serbia and Montenegro against internationally recognized Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The second view is that there was a civil war going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this civil war was essentially between, or rather among, three nations which pursued their own mutually exclusive political agendas. If you apply the criteria of the International Red Cross for armed conflict, the war in Bosnia was certainly not international conflict, that is, civil war. There are 7 such criteria which have been worked out by the International Red Cross. I am not going to enumerate them, because it would take time. But that does not necessarily mean that the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina did not have another aspect. It certainly had also an aspect of international conflict because of involvement of Croatia, which was heavily involved in the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and because of the involvement of the GNA, at least until May 1992, when it was formally pulled out of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with some units remaining, of course. And this opinion is expressed by the International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia in the appeals chamber in Tadic case. And I think it would be also relevant to mention that, as you probably know, in 1993, Bosnia and Herzegovina sued Serbia for an alleged aggression and genocide in the United Nations International Court of Justice. And this case took 14 years to resolve. 14 years. And finally, in 2007, the court announced its judgment and determined Serbia had not committed genocide in violation of its obligations under the Convention of Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So you can judge for yourself if this was a conflict or a civil war. I am inclined to believe that it was a civil war with some aspects of an international conflict.
How do you define the character of crimes against the Serb citizens in the part of Sarajevo under Muslim control, where the SDA party played a key role?
The allegations of crimes against Serb civilians in Sarajevo are well known. There were plenty reports and plenty of media reports and speculations about that. Generally speaking, killing of civilians in time of war is a war crime. Just as simple as that. It is because it takes place in a war situation and because the international criminal law explicitly bans killing civilians during war situations. I am not a judge, and therefore I cannot really make my opinion on each individual case. This, in fact, is the task of the court system of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But speaking of the SDA, we must bear in mind that SDA was the governing political party in Sarajevo under the RBH control. And nothing was happening in Sarajevo without SDA's knowledge. This is a hard fact, which means that it bears its part of responsibility for what happened to Serb civilians in the city between 92 and 95.
You already told about crimes against the Serbs in Sarajevo, but what do you know more about the systematic destruction of the Serb community in Army of Republic of BiH controlled part of Sarajevo? What was the role of SDA party and its partners in this process?
You know, this issue has been addressed by numerous international analysts. Of course, this issue cannot really be completely disregarded if we are serious about the study of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we are serious. I would like an excerpt from the book by United States National Security Agency analyst John Schindler, who has been dealing with the issue of liability for crimes against Serbs in Sarajevo for a long time. So let me just read it to you. The culpability of the SDA leadership for such crimes, long denied by Izetbegovich's defenders, is no longer in doubt. It is impossible to believe that the government was unaware of the catastrophe happening in front of them. Besieged Sarajevo was a very small place. Those reporters who cared to know had no trouble discovering the outlines of the story. I must say that it is very difficult to imagine that SDA's war goal was to retain Serbs in Sarajevo. On the contrary, the SDA had a completely different agenda. Its goal was essentially to drive the Serbs out of Sarajevo. And this was manifested in many things, in physical harassment, in killing, in illegal expropriation of property, in desecration of cemeteries and churches, and so on and so forth. As a result, we're now dealing with the situation in the pre-war Serb community in Sarajevo virtually ceased to exist. This is also a hard fact.
Can you give us some concrete examples of systematic war crimes against Serbs in Sarajevo, as well as examples of forced detention and deportation to prisons and camps?
There is sufficient evidence that RBH soldiers in Sarajevo, particularly those belonging to the 9th Brigade under Ramis Devalic and 10th Brigade under Mujan Topalovic Tsasov, were involved in systematic campaign of extortion, abuse, torture, beatings, and murder of Serb civilians. The case of Kazani mass grave is common knowledge. It's really a public secret. So some people, even today, try to hide facts related to this particular crime. There are many sources which we have studied regarding the war crimes against Serbs in Sarajevo. One is, which I recommend to everyone who would like to learn more about this subject, is a good book written by Sarajevo University professor Mirko Pijanovic. The book is entitled Serbo-Bosnian Eyes. As he put it in this book, a Serb was not protected as a citizen, as a person, because he was a Serb. The abuse of Serbs in Sarajevo really acquired huge dimensions. As I said already, this included killings, murders, arbitrary arrests, robberies, beatings, and so on and so forth. And of course, forceful evictions from apartments. In fact, I was a witness in Sarajevo when a colleague of mine who was also working in civil affairs was kicked out of his apartment together with the Serb landlord by the BH army soldiers without any reason, just because the landlord was Serb. Regarding the forced detention and deportation to prisons and camps, there is also ample evidence. This is also a public secret, you know. Again, United States National Security Agency analyst John Schindler assessed that there were private prisons in Sarajevo, and these private prisons mushroomed after the breakout of the war, because each particular paramilitary group or each particular brigade even had its own private prisons, more or less, where they were detaining Serbs for exchange, either for money or any other kind of ransom. I have seen documents signed by Sarajevo late Judge Marko Kirivic, who indicated that at various stages of the war there were about 126 prison camps for Serbs in Sarajevo. Well, some other documents suggest that this number was even higher, 188. The Serb inmates were also kept in concentration camps in Tarchin and Chelebeci. This is a common fact. And these facts related to inhuman treatment of Serb inmates in these camps were reflected in UN reports and sentences by the International Tribunal from the former Yugoslavia.
And from a military point of view, was the army of Republic of BiH controlled Sarajevo under the siege, or was it in a partial blockade by local Serbs who were defending their homes and settlements?
You know, if you look at the VRS documents, particularly the VRS main staff documents, as well as Sarajevo Romania court documents, they never mention siege. They mention the professional military term blockade, which is in agreement with the GNA official doctrine and terminology as outlined in the GNA military lexicon. In fact, the RBIH also used the same lexicon for its own purposes. The military lexicon of GNA does not have such term as siege. It has the term of blockade. And the difference between the siege and blockade may appear insignificant to a layman, but in reality, the main difference lies in the choice of weapons by the attacking side. Historically, the main weapon of siege has been starvation. That is, the attacker was trying to starve the defenders to this or to surrender. If you look at the situation in Sarajevo, the population of Sarajevo was, of course, in a very difficult situation. It lacked food, and it had a supply which was regularly interrupted, and electricity was in a very short supply. But on the other hand, Sarajevo was getting such humanitarian aid, which was not the case in other historical I must say that some historians like to draw parallels between the siege of Leningrad in World War II and the siege of Sarajevo. In total honesty, the siege of Sarajevo did not really stand any comparison to the siege of Leningrad, because in Leningrad, about 1 million people died of starvation only, because the German command deliberately chose siege and starvation as its main weapon to force the city into the submission, which never happened. This is not to say that the population of Sarajevo in the part of the city under the control of the government did not suffer in the various blockade. It certainly did suffer. But the military history of Lenin stands as an example of the cruelty of a real siege in a real.
In June 1992, Republic of Srpska ceded the airport to the United Nations. Throughout the war, you already mentioned, humanitarian aid was coming to the Army Republic of BiH controlled part of Sarajevo. Is it true that at that same time civilians were allowed to cross the airport accompanied by UN, and there was Army Republic of BiH controlled territory on both sides of the airport?
Yes, you're right. In June 1992, Republika Srpska ceded the Sarajevo airport to the United Nations. This was the result of the negotiations between Republika Srpska and General Mackenzie. And this made it possible to arrange a massive humanitarian airlift to Sarajevo. I just would like to say a few words about the humanitarian lift, since in the previous question you asked me what kind of siege the Sarajevo experienced. Just to give you a few figures. According to open sources, despite various incidents between June 92 and January 96, almost 13,000 United Nations flights landed at Sarajevo airport and delivered about 180,000 tons of humanitarian cargo. These included about 150,000 tons of food. Sarajevo was not completely isolated either, because numerous international agencies and delegations were coming to Sarajevo. According to the data of the first core of the RBIH, between 92 and 95, numerous delegations visited Sarajevo, including 11 presidents, 8 prime ministers, 31 ministers, 29 ambassadors, and the United Nations Secretary General. Regarding your other questions, whether the airport was used for exiting from Sarajevo, yes, this is true. In fact, this situation was very well described by French General Valentin, who was the sector commander in Sarajevo between 92 and 93, and I was his chief of staff, so I can actually confirm everything that he said. We really had a big problem with Sarajevo agreement between UNPROFOR and the Serbs, because this agreement said that UNPROFOR will not allow the other side to use the airport for its purposes. But people in Sarajevo were getting so desperate that, especially during the winter months, in winter of 1993, lots of people, big crowds, were really trying to cross the airport runway out of Sarajevo to Krasnica, Hadžići, and so on into central Bosnia or in Croatia. And in the process, many of them were injured or killed because fighting did not stop around. So what Unprofor did, we had a meeting with the Serbs and Muslims. We suggested to them that men between the age of 17 and 60 would be considered combatants, and they would be allowed to cross the runway at their own risk. But we suggested also that we could take women and children in APCs by agreement, by of both parties, under protection across the airport, out of the city if they wanted to. This was the agreement which was suggested. The Serbs agreed, Muslims did not. So this was never materialized. In fact, Colonel Valentin, or as a General Valentin, describes an incident in which he personally pleaded with Bosnian authorities to let a Serb woman, old lady who was terminally ill with cancer, to let out of the city. They did not.
If is it claimed that part of Sarajevo was under the siege, does it mean that UN, United Nations, participated in this siege? You already mentioned, you said, but could civilians escape from the Army Republic of BiH controlled part of Sarajevo across the airport runway? And did the Army of BiH forces prevented them from leaving the city through Army of BiH ring?
This was impossible, and this was totally out of the question because Unprofor had a different mandate. It never has been a task of Unprofor to keep the siege of Sarajevo. Unprofor did not have any checkpoints at the entry points to Sarajevo. All these checkpoints were meant on one hand, on that one side of the confrontation line by the DRS, on the other side of the confrontation line by the RBIH. Indeed, in my recollection, my opinion, there were two blockades of Sarajevo, if you wish. And this was the so-called outer ring. And there was also an inner ring by the RBIH. And in fact, the RBIH did prevent people from leaving Sarajevo. Of course, the official explanation for men to leave was that they needed for the defense of the city. But they also prevented women and children from leaving. Exception was made only for a limited number of vulnerable cases, which were evacuated with the assistance of Unprofor. And this observation of mine is shared by many other international observers who were dealing with this situation at the time. This is described, for example, by Lord Owen, the Bosnian Odyssey, the title of the book is, in which he plainly writes they did two blockades in Sarajevo, and Bosnian government did not really want to let its people out because it hoped this way to gain more international sympathy. This is what Lord Owen said. And this is also the opinion of General Valentin, whom I have already mentioned.
There are many testimonies of Serbian citizens that they were not allowed to leave the part of Sarajevo under Muslim control due to existence of the inner military ring held by so-called army BIH. What is your knowledge on this issue?
Just to illustrate this point, I can quote for you the description of Sarajevo situation in 1993, which was made by General Valentine. I read it out. There was a Serbian minority inside Sarajevo that was completely blocked, surrounded by the Bosnians, who were surrounded by the Serbs laying siege to the city. I wanted to get an elderly Serbian woman to serve cancer out, and the Bosnians refused to allow to leave. The negotiations to get the elderly woman cancer took up to 3 weeks. Finally, Serbs and Croats showed up with the signed papers for departure, but not the Mongols. They refused. Well, in fact, there was a propaganda war going on along with the real war on the ground at the same time. And in this war, the Bosnian government desperately needed international assistance and international sympathy. For this reason, they didn't want the Serb population or even Bosnian, their own population, to leave Sarajevo. They wanted them to stay in to attract international attention to its plight.
We are all aware of the historical role of Serbian community in building a modern European city of Sarajevo after the liberation of Turkish occupation, aggression, whatever. After your research into the fate of this community during the war of the 1990s, what happened to the large and very important Serbian Christian community in the Muslim part of Sarajevo and their presence in all segments of life in this city?
Yes, of course you are right. The Serb community existed in Sarajevo for centuries. In socialist Yugoslavia, the Serb community in Sarajevo was a vibrant economic and scientific entity and consisted of almost 30% of the entire Sarajevo population. If you also add Yugoslavs, who were by and large mostly of Serb origin, this figure becomes even higher. Many entrepreneurs, doctors, economists, lecturers, and professors of Serb and Montenegrin origin lived and worked in Sarajevo. Many Serb writers, artists, musicians, lecturers left a lasting cultural heritage in Sarajevo. But the brutality of the war, Serbophobia, hatred, and immense pressure on the Serb community in Sarajevo were the factors which determined the exodus of Serbs in Sarajevo. This was quiet and tacit exodus almost invisible by the international community. But it nevertheless happened. And this is probably the biggest exodus of Serbs from one single location in this century.
Were the representatives of the international community aware of what was happening to the Serb population? And if they were, why they did not inform the public in BiH and abroad?
This is not entirely true, you know. In fact, the human rights issues were never a part of UNPROFOR formal mandate. If you look at all the UN Security Council resolutions related to UNPROFOR, UNPROFOR was specifically dealing with delivery of humanitarian aid and creating conditions for amelioration of the situation and making the conflict stop. It was mainly composed of military contingents. The mandate for the human rights, and including, of course, the monitoring of Serb community in Sarajevo, was possessed by United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, and his office maintained in presence in Sarajevo. They also submitted periodic reports on the human rights situation to the Secretary General of the United Nations. And to an extent, the situation of Sarajevo Serbs was reflected in these reports. I remember some of these reports who definitely said that the Serb population in Sarajevo was really suffering under the rule of Bosnian government. Only after the war, the UN mission in Bosnia started monitoring human rights issues in Bosnia and assisted in restructuring the BiH judicial system. And I must say that in this sense, they did quite a good job. I have written several reports about the situation of the Serbs in Sarajevo myself, and we were also monitoring the perpetrators of some crimes against them. But you must understand that it was not the task of the United Nations mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina to bring those responsible for those crimes to responsibility. But in fact, the situation of human rights was adequately reported, I think, and reflected in our reports to the Secretary General.
Mr. Bezruchenko, thank you for speaking about this most important subject for our people, for our nation, for Republic of Srpska. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your time, sir. It was my pleasure.
Poštovani gledalci, razgovarali smo sa potpredsjednikom Nezavisne međunarodne komisije za istraživanje stradanja Srba u Sarajevu u periodu od 1991. do 1995. godine, Viktorom Bezručenkom, koji je bio u Petrogradu. Hvala vam na pažnji i ostanite i dalje uz naš program.